Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for cutting your lunch short to come and hear me today. I'm Macgregor. I'm the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and I want to talk to you today a little bit about an exhibition that we've recently worked on and about our interest on how the whole issue of environmental damage and climate change can be reconsidered through the eyes of artists. On August this year, we opened an exhibition called In the Balance, and it was extraordinary timing, of course, because it was exactly at the moment that the world watched with horror as the oil gushed forth in the Gulf here. We started planning the show at actually rather short notice about a year ago when we had a gap in programming, and I sometimes feel that that's when your best projects occur, when it's you're a bit under pressure. And I sat with the curatorial team and we thought about what we could put together, and the team were very concerned about the whole issue of the environment, particularly given the stresses that we feel in Australia, a country with huge issues with drought, despite the fact I gather it's been raining for nearly a week in Sydney. And of course the destruction of the wonderful forests of Tasmania, which has become such a symbol for environmental destruction. So we decided to proceed with an exhibition and invite a number of artists, both Australian and international, to see how we could present something that really would raise awareness about the condition and about the way that artists were operating. And of course we realized very quickly when we began to do the research that this is not a new issue, that of course artists have been involved in environmental activism in various ways for many, many years. The curatorial team was led by our senior curator, Rachel Kent, with Glenn Barclay, Anna Davis, and importantly, our Aboriginal curator, Keith Munro, which brings in a very interesting dimension to this project. We divided it into 4 sections. We started looking, first of all, at Tasmania, that rather extraordinary island in the south of Australia, where there's been so much damage and so many incredible campaigns, and where many artists have played a key role. The second key issue that I'll go through is to do with the Murray-Darling River and to do with the degradation of that particular environment, where that great waterway has really been virtually destroyed. The third aspect looks at the relationship between industry and the environment, particularly the impact of the mining industry. And finally, we felt we had to end on something of a note of optimism. So the final section looks at strategies that artists are adopting in order to deal with some of these issues. The artists all come from different viewpoints. Some are actually not involved in activism at all. Others do believe that their work can actually work within the political environment and act for social change. I'm starting in Tasmania. This is the work of the photographer Peter Trombovsky, who made these extraordinary images in 1983 in an attempt to prevent the damming of this extraordinary river. This image really became a leitmotif of the campaign and played an absolutely critical role in preventing the damage of this amazing environment. It was used in a number of contexts, particularly on the posters, and in fact became a political issue and resulted, as I say, in this damming being prevented. We presented it in the exhibition alongside the posters, alongside his images. But this was actually building on an earlier tradition by an extraordinary photographer called Olegas Truchanas, who made these images of Lake Pedder in 1971, not as photographs, but as a slideshow that he took on the road and presented to packed houses in town halls all over Tasmania. Sadly, however, this did not succeed, and this extraordinary piece of environment was destroyed by a hydroelectric scheme. We represented Olegas's original slideshow by redigitizing and remastering it, and for the first time it was shown in a visual arts context. Of course, it will not have escaped anybody's notice that at this time, this kind of work was very much out of step with the art world. This somewhat romantic photographic imagery was not what was being dealt with by serious artists who were much more concerned with conceptual issues. This indeed was even more romanticized because when Olegas presented it, he presented it with no sound except the extraordinary soundtrack of Delius's music. So it was indeed a very deliberate attempt to play on the emotions. Sadly, as I said, unsuccessful. These images were very much of their time, unlike this one by David Stevenson, an American photographer who moved to Tasmania in the 80s and again was very influenced by what was happening. This is a much more knowing and photographic, art world photographic work, looking very carefully at reconstructing an idea of a 19th century panorama. It's entitled Self-Portrait, Looking Down a Survey Cut, Proposed Site of the Gordon Below the Franklin Dam, 1982. It's a large-scale work, and it's not designed as a form of activism. His work is more about the concerns of photography, but also about the relationship between people and the environment. The concern with Tasmania is not restricted to older artists. There's a whole new generation of young artists taking action. This is a video by James Hewitt called Passive Aggressive, which documents encounters between the loggers whose livelihood depends on this work and the activists determined to prevent this extraordinary destruction. However, nowhere in James's videos do you actually see the banners. He photographs them, films them from behind, so he's trying not to buy in directly to the political context. In fact, he says, I'm not an activist. I'm not here to assert a political message. I want to talk about the complexities and the social and cultural perspectives of these kinds of issues. Another artist, Raquel Ormella, is much more clear-cut in her position. She did a residency in the Wilderness Society's headquarters in Hobart and made this whiteboard piece. On one side, contrasting the bureaucratic blandness of the Environmental Campaign Office, and on the other side, the extraordinary beauty of the black and white depictions of the trees that are being destroyed. Catherine Rogers has been documenting the area for over 20 years, looking not only at the trees that are being lost, but the impact on the biodiversity, the impact on all species by the destructions of these trees. Her images also are not just presented as large images as we see here in the gallery, but were also produced as postcards and flyers, and very much were part of the campaign to raise the awareness by recording, as she describes it, the disappearing and the disappeared. In the second section of the exhibition, we looked at the Murray-Darling River, and this allowed us to consider the role of Aboriginal people in the care of the environment. This work by Yvonne Kulamatri, a Wiradjuri woman, she is a pioneer in revising, redefining and recontextualizing traditional basket-making practices, making work from the river's sedge rushes, a sculptural reinterpretation of the historical fish and eel traps used along the river by her forebears. Nikki Cumston, a Barkindji woman, has made an extraordinary series of photographs, a very devastating critique of what has happened to traditional lands. The artist Bonita Ely, who's worked for many years, in fact over 3 decades in the area, documenting the shocking degree of mismanagement, negligence and abuse, and very potently in a performance where she mixes all these extraordinary ingredients together to try and make a cocktail of all the potent things that are happening in the river. Just some of the ingredients she puts together as she's pretending to be a hostess on a TV cooking show: deadly chemicals, salt in abundance, human and animal waste, quantities of introduced species that have caused so much damage, including rabbits and European carp, which she proceeds to drink, much to the horror of the audience. Bonita updated this performance and entitled it All New Murray River Punch, the 21st Century, in 2010, some 20 years after the original performance. And here she added the ingredients that have come out of the river as a result of drought: sulfuric acid and chlorine, plastic bottles and bags, aluminium cans, plague locusts, powder of river red gums and blue-green algae, an even more toxic mix than was there when she did the original performance in the 1980s. The fourth section deals with industry, and David Stevenson's more recent image starts it very well. The zinc works, and in the distance, Mount Wellington, a beautiful, beautiful section of the landscape, destroyed by man's greed. The Weather Group is a group of artists and activists and media workers interested in drawing attention to all these issues, composed of David Mackenzie, Susan Norrie and Sumagan Sivanathan. This is Geoffrey Lee, an extraordinary man from Kakadu National Park who has land near the Kungara mining lease and has held out against the miners who wish to excavate uranium worth over $5 billion. The potential impact on his people and the desire of Aboriginal people caught between wishing to preserve their traditional extraordinary landscapes and, of course, what this money could actually do for their communities is a very, very potent struggle. And Geoffrey Lee has become an incredible spokesperson for the desire to preserve the land as it was, having seen the degradation caused by the nearby Ranger uranium mine. More than 150 leaks, spills, and license breaches occurring since its inception in 1981. The Weather Group's video installation in the exhibition juxtaposes the landscape with interviews with Geoffrey, where he talks with such passion about his land. I'm delighted to say that this is a success story. In June 2010, the Federal Environment Minister annexed this land to Kakadu National Park, so it can no longer be under threat from mining. Further afield, in Indonesia, Susan Norrie and David Mackenzie of the Weather Group became aware of this incredible environmental disaster in Sidoarjo, a mud eruption, sulfurous mud, erupting as a result of the mining by Lapinto for oil and gas, destroying 12 villages, displacing over 50,000 people, and the mud keeps coming. For the 52nd Venice Biennale, they produced a work called Havoc, a multi-screen installation. And for our exhibition In the Balance, Korban Lumpur project, where they looked at the ongoing impact on people's lives of this extraordinary catastrophe. A performance by Didang Cristanto that took place on the lawn of the Museum of Contemporary Art also pays homage to these victims. A silent protest, a pepe in Indonesian, where 100 volunteers covered in mud stood on the lawns of the museum with photographs of the victims. The performance was originally performed in Jakarta in 2008 for Human Rights Day, and it was extraordinarily impactful, particularly in the context of the museum's location right on Circular Quay, opposite the Opera House, one of the most potent sites in Australia, and packed with people at the weekends. Andrea Bowers, who I'm delighted to notice is speaking after me today. I need say little other than the title of this work, Step It Up Activist, Sand Key Reef, Key West, Florida, part of North America's only remaining coral barrier reef. In her major installation in the museum, she presented Mercy, Mercy Me, titled after Marvin Gaye's song from 1971 about the war, civil rights, and the environment. Andrea is very concerned, like James Newitt, with the complexities of these issues, where, as she describes it, Eurocentrist environmentalists are coming into contact with some of the most poor people of the world with very different concerns, and how sometimes these concerns can be in conflict and sometimes they can be united. In the case of Alaska, she was working with the people working around the 20th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez disaster. And again, the fact that this exhibition was timed to present this work exactly at the time of the second disaster in the Gulf. Very potent and moving work. And Andrea is certainly an activist. The final section, Positive Outcomes. This is the work of Lauren Berkowitz, who for many years has been creating sculptures out of plastic bags and other detritus that normally goes to landfill. She meticulously collects and creates these very beautiful installations. The work of the Yoruba Collective, who make paper from the cotton rag pulps. Cotton is, of course, a devastating crop for the environment. And the cotton rags are usually sent to landfill. The Yoruba people have put together a collective to turn the pulp into paper which they sell, so it creates industry and employment for Aboriginal people. But they've also documented their relationship with the river and created these very beautiful artworks which we presented in the museum. Another wonderful recycling story, this time in the very far north of Australia, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, where a major threat to the wildlife is the fishing nets, abandoned fishing nets that are brought down by the southeast trade winds from Southeast Asia and cause enormous threat to a number of turtle species in the area and other marine life. 18 Aboriginal communities have banded together to work on this project, to remove these nets from the ocean and recycle them as artworks, as weavings, as objects. Aboriginal people, of course, have a long history of looking after the land and the sea, and this is a detail of a work by Cecilia Peters. In the foreground of this slide, we have the work of Emily Floyd, who looks at formal and informal education systems and presents sculptural reinterpretations of text. In the double helix of 140 beechwood blocks, there are inscribed the URLs of dozens of websites of activism and political movements, paying homage to all the informal learning sites and the way in which we can pull information from the internet. In the background is a previous work by her of prints that were used also in a political context. And also in this slide, the work of Lorraine Connolly-Northey, another Aboriginal artist, who uses the cast-off things from farms, rusty metal, barbed wire and so on, to remap ideas of the river. Lorraine is a Wiradjuri artist. And from San Francisco, Amy Francischini and Future Farmers, a collective working around the boundaries of art, design and activism, who presented a sunshine still, a prototype for a machine that will create ethanol-based biofuel and drinking water from compost. And here is the car, the pedal power car that will go and collect the compost from people's houses to fuel the sunshine still. They're playing here with ideas about distilling, creating alcohol, and very much a sort of homegrown country kind of activity. And this is another theme that runs through the more optimistic side of the exhibition about how we can return to more traditional methods of living and interacting with the land. And of course, plants. Here in another installation by Lauren Berkowitz, edible plants. Oops, went too fast. The work of Janet Lawrence, cellular gardens, where breathing begins, placed alongside a large screen installation of extinct animal species, or animal species who are liable to become extinct, making the point about the interrelatedness of plant life and biodiversity on the planet. A light-hearted look at the natural world by Diego Bonetto, the Weedy Project. This consists of 5 terrariums, 5 tours around the city, and a world of Facebook friends. He placed local soil samples in the terrariums and allowed the weeds to grow. And of course, traditionally we think of weeds as being a bad thing, but essentially they're just plants growing in the wrong place. He then organized tours of the city to look at these weeds and asks people on Facebook to adopt a weed in order to change our attitude to this life and in our sense of trying to clean up the environment and get rid of things that are unwelcome, when in fact we should be embracing all forms of plant life. The work of Tessa Zettel and Carl Zoe, a makeshift food stall which was placed on in front of the museum. You can see what I mean about our location, right opposite the Opera House. Inside the food stall, they put native bees to create honey and plants, edible plants again, and a little ability to cook. And they held seminars and discussions on the lawn talking about the area, which was very important in terms of food sources for Australia, because it's the site of the first landings where all the ships were brought in. And the museum is now on the site of what was called the Commissariat store, which was where obviously they put all the foodstuffs. This was a project which was able to be moved around, and as you see here, put in front of the museum. A Sydney collective, Artist as Family, who create gardens. This one in front of a church for the local community. They planted all kinds of fruit and vegetables and called on the community to come and pick whatever they liked as things grow. So this is a living artwork that continues. Of course, attracted a lot of attention. Edible art at church was a pretty good headline. Johnny Taylor, Urban Wildlife Safari, looking at the relationship between people, architecture and nature. These are the extraordinary fruit bats that you see flying over Sydney. She took people on tours looking at the urban wasteland and looking at the city from the perspective of flora and fauna, and how astonished we were to find that in among the skyscrapers of Sydney there was indeed so much flora and fauna. The work of Lyndall Jones, this is a sound work. The speakers you can see presented on this panel here are the voices of the people of Avoca, another country town in Australia, where Lyndall Jones has an ongoing project, a range of projects, in this case where she's interviewed the local people who are very, very acutely aware of the impact of drought, because they're all farming people. And even more, I think, than the city, are conscious of what is happening to the environment. Lucas Island, perhaps one of the most challenging projects. Lucas was in residence at the museum for 6 months prior to the exhibition, and he undertook an environmental audit. In fact, he examined every aspect of the museum, and I have to admit it was somewhat confronting what he brought to our attention. He presented it there in the exhibition in the form of this room where he plotted everything that he discovered, and he initiated many different discussions with different groups about it, really making us and the whole staff indeed aware of what was happening in the museum, and in fact how bad our ecological footprint is. That led to the setting up within the museum of a sustainability subgroup with a number of people drawn from right across the museum to come up with new initiatives. And these are some of the things we're looking at. And I was particularly interested to discover number 2, which is to do with the amount of information that we store on our server. I think we all assume that with computers we're actually somehow being more ecological because we're not printing and we're not using paper in the same way, but in fact we're using an incredible amount of energy. And by changing the way we had our servers, actually quite a simple thing to do, which we did with sponsorship, we estimate that we've reduced our carbon footprint by 80 to 100 tons. We've done all the usual things with lighting, of course, energy efficient bulbs. We participate in Earth Hour, recycling, all the usual things, reusing coffee cups, double-sided printing. How many institutions don't realize how much paper they're going through when they allow their printer to be set on each side? And the usual sort of initiatives. And what's actually really heartening about this is that the whole museum, including the board, has bought into this initiative, and we're all extremely conscious now about what we're doing. We're also working on a new development. We're expanding the museum at the moment, and we've worked very hard with ESD consultants to incorporate passive design technologies and all the things we can do, which is very difficult in a building which is an old building, to actually retrofit all these things. And one of the good things is that we're being able to install a seawater exchange, pulling water from the sea. There's a very complex diagram, which I don't even understand, that shows you how it comes in. But essentially, we use the seawater to cool as the coolant, and that is going to reduce our power bill by some 30%. On the left here, you can see the old building, which, as I've said, was very difficult to retrofit. And on the right, the new building. So by putting up a new building and making sure that we use a lot of recycled materials, and we produce that building in collaboration with our architect and build it to the highest possible green standards, we're actually able to make a huge benefit on the old building. And in fact, we're expecting our power bills to drop by some 30%, which may explain why the board is so happy about it, because it saves substantial amounts of money. And just to show you what's happening in this building, it's a new wing with a lot of education facilities which we currently don't have. And digital media classroom, which again will allow us to provide our resources to venues right across Australia, and particularly rural and regional areas. So a lot of the subject matter that we had in the Balance exhibition will now become available as education resources, not just for visitors to the museum, but as part of our archive and as part of our downloadable resources that students right across Australia can have access to whenever they're studying the environment. So the museum becomes a site for dissemination of information far beyond what we can do within one exhibition, which was only on for some 10 weeks. This is our new gallery space. And of course, one of the things that Lucas Island has challenged us on is the fact that we bring exhibitions internationally and we fly artists. In fact, I hate to think what my carbon footprint is, having flown here for 4 days, for 24 hours in the air for 4 days. Our lecture theatre, which again is technologically wired for across Australia. And that's just to show off our wonderful site, which is, as I said, opposite the Opera House. So that gives you some sense of how I think artists and museums can start to reconsider and take responsibility for their impact on the environment. I'm a great believer that we need to bring out the history. We need to show what artists have always done and the role they've played, because I think our politicians often dismiss the role of the arts and what artists can actually achieve. And I think by doing this exhibition, we really galvanized attention in Sydney and indeed in Australia. Our coverage went way beyond the museum. We had a lot of really fantastic coverage, lots of things online, lots of blogs, lots of interaction. And as I say, it's very important that that becomes part of the museum's website and people can access it. We did print a catalogue. We did think about whether we should. We've printed it on recycled paper, and I have a copy here, so if anybody's interested, do come and have a look at it. The new building will reopen in 2012, and I'm very confident that as we move towards 2012, with the buy-in that we've got from everybody throughout the organisation, we'll be constantly looking and challenging our own practices and very much working with artists on an ongoing basis to see how we can really make a difference to what I think we all still feel is one of the greatest challenges facing us today. Thank you very much.